Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome back David Welch, Detroit Bureau Chief Bloomberg. Welcome back, David.
Thanks for having me. Always fun and always good to be.
It's always fun to have you here because you have some of the most interesting insights into markets and mobility, and they're fun conversations. So I'm going to start this super high level. What is your opinion on the current state of the autonomous vehicle industry?
I think several years ago, you and I were saying in various places. I did a column in our Hyperdrive portal about it, and we both talked about it on Twitter, that there would be a shakeout. And now look, it didn't take any brilliant insight to figure that out. Some of these companies were backed by billions of dollars in investment, and some were backed by tens of millions of dollars in investment. And you could see who was going to survive a fight like that. And a lot of those smaller players have gone by the wayside. Some went bankrupt, some were just acquired and folded in to the bigger players, stuff like that. So right now, you're kind of seeing this fight among, or maybe a race is a better way to put it, to get some sort of autonomous business to market. And it's Waymo, it's Argo, Aurora, and Cruise. Probably a few others out there, but those are the big players. It reminds me, something Dan Ammon, the CEO of Cruise, told me like 3 years ago when I was working on the cover story on GM. He said, the world doesn't need a dozen autonomous vehicle stacks in the same way that it doesn't need a dozen operating systems, right? I mean, for phones, you basically have Android and iOS. So you'll see this shakeout where we get down to a small number of them. And he's betting that his will be one. And look, they're pretty well funded. They're going to deploy pretty soon if they can get licensing in California, and they'll probably move to other places where it's easier to get a license. Florida, probably. They've already announced Dubai. And I think Waymo is following suit pretty quickly as well. They've already got a small deployment going on in Arizona. Pretty small area and pretty easy to drive, but they're starting to move. So look, the better players here are either on the cusp of or just starting to actually put people from the it's kind of like non-insider public into their cars, and others are always talking about it, and then many others have just gone by the wayside. And it really is getting down to a handful of companies that are going to be in this business.
Do you feel that one of Cruise's competitive advantages that they have real business leadership at the top and they have a rock stars for policy team so they can navigate the political world and the business world where some of their other competitors don't have the same amount of talent?
Look, I know they have a good policy team. I don't know that much about some of the others, the policy teams in places like Waymo and Argo and so forth. I got to think they're not bad. So I don't know if they have an advantage there or not, just because it's not my turn. You'd have much better insights into that than I do. I think, just kind of spitballing here, I think one of the advantages that Cruise has, and in a way it's a disadvantage, but this is a pretty well-funded company with money from GM, and then you've got SoftBank money and a bunch of others in there. But it's not funded like Waymo is with Google money. Google just has tons and tons of cash. I could look up their cash balance if you wanted to know the latest, but it's in the tens of billions of dollars. And when you're like Cruise and you don't have unlimited money, you got to get to market quickly. There's a, let's call it Adam Smith's invisible foot, kicking you to get something out the door and start paying your own way. I've always thought that that's something that they have going for them, and maybe Argo does too, because they're owned by car companies. Car companies have a decent amount of cash, but nowhere near the tech giants, and they really do have to move. I do think the autonomous players like Cruise and Argo, I think it is an advantage being, lashed together with car companies. In Argo's case, it's Ford and Volkswagen, because you have vehicles, right? And your engineers are working with the software and code writers and artificial intelligence scientists to integrate as you're going along. I think that's an advantage when you're putting the product and the software together as you test, as you develop. I just do. Not being on the inside, I know, but I think that's a big advantage, and I think that's another reason why they can get to market faster. So one's motivational, and one is you've got car people there to help you integrate software into the vehicle.
That's going to be really helpful when you go to scale, because you have the technicians that understand welding, they understand how an assembly line works, all of these things that are not necessarily thought about. So that's a huge advantage.
One thing I know, when GM first acquired Cruise, some people on the auto company side told me that the people at Cruise didn't quite understand and appreciate all of the safety regulations that go into a car. All the things NHTSA makes a car company do, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, all of that stuff. It's very deep, it's very intricate, very difficult to get through if you're not used to it. And the car companies just have this machine that does all of that testing, crash testing, and everything else almost out of muscle memory, whereas the Silicon Valley companies, software companies, and startups do not. They don't even, they have to go out and hire those people, and it's just not a machine the way it is at big car companies. That is another advantage. It's not insurmountable, but it's a big advantage.
Well, Alphabet, it's basically an ATM machine, just spits off massive amounts of cash, and they're pouring billions into Waymo. Waymo doesn't have a strategy. They seem lost. You have co-CEOs. There's no consistent message to the market. When does one of these large institutional investors say, what are you doing? Where's your next massive source of profits? When are you going to get this business going? You had a giant lead, and now your lead is evaporating. You're no longer in the lead.
It's hard to know that for sure, just because there's always been a game of liar's poker about who was in the lead and who was doing what in autonomy. But I think Waymo's strategy is still to get in the robo-taxi game. And they're starting to work in California to do that, and certainly working in Arizona. But it's where they go beyond suburban Phoenix and how quickly and what their plan is to expand. They just haven't said. I don't think they've got unlimited time and unlimited money to do this anymore. The parent company, Alphabet, has basically said they don't want to forever pump billions of dollars into science projects. This thing has to start earning its way over time. And they've sunk a lot of time and a lot of money into it. So I can, look, they've applied for a lot of the same permits that Cruise has. So they'll probably get to market with these services around the same time GM does. I don't think it's fair to say they don't have a strategy. They have talked about it a lot less. Look, GM went out on an investor day a month or two ago and said that Cruise was going to be $50 billion in revenue by the end of the decade of this big growth plan that GM has. That's a big statement. And at any big company, if you go out publicly and say, we're going to do this, it kind of embarrasses everybody if you don't get it done. So it is a real way for Dan Ammon and Mary Barra to make the team try to hit this goal.
You look at big statements around revenue expectations. The one thing that blows my mind, why is there this unique obsession to launch in San Francisco? You've got the California Public Utilities Commission. You've got the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. They don't want you. Why fight? Why not go to somewhere where you're welcome and you can generate revenue? What do you think it is, this obsession around deploying in San Francisco? Everybody working on AVs outside of Argo wants to deploy there. Why?
I've been asking this question of Cruise for a long time now. And there are two reasons, I think. One, they started there, all their scientists and software people are there. And early days of developing the software, I think it's good to have everybody there to troubleshoot problems and work with the vehicles that are right in your garage. And San Francisco, it's like a hilly version of Manhattan in terms of driving. So if you can drive there, you can drive anywhere. And that's been Cruise's mission all along, is get these things to drive well and safely in the toughest driving environment there is. And then deploying in suburban Phoenix, Miami, Midwestern cities with broad, wide highways. It's a snap. And all of that makes sense. The problem to what you're getting at is the regulators are inhospitable. And so, or at least, more difficult, shall we say, than Arizona, than Florida, and probably a lot of other states, than Michigan for that matter. So now that they've presumably learned to drive pretty well around San Francisco, why not go to Arizona? Why not go to Florida? Why not go to Michigan? Why not go to Dubuque? I mean, there are all kinds of places where they can go where the driving is easier and the regulatory environment is. A lot of these other places that we're talking about would probably fall over themselves to have these companies put up some operations and a service for, to link up with public transit or provide something for populations that need autonomous driving, like the handicapped, the elderly, and groups like that. Yeah, I'm assuming we're going to see that. I'm kind of with you, though. Why haven't we seen it already?
You look at all this. There's the obsession of San Francisco. Anybody, if you want to challenge me in an economics debate, I don't see how you're going to make a profitable robotaxi service in San Francisco. When you factor in the taxes, the regulations, I don't see how you'll ever become profitable in San Francisco. I'm sitting here, an outsider looking in, and I ask this question all the time, and I love your opinion. Why not go to Reedy Creek, Florida? Reedy Creek, Florida is incorporated as Walt Disney World. That's where it is, Reedy Creek. Driving around Walt Disney World is very easy. The roads are wide, they're clean, it's large, and you have a lot of tourists that are constantly going there every day to see Mickey Mouse and all of his pals. So you've got a built-in base to charge. Why is somebody not deployed in Walt Disney World yet when there is a clear case to be made from a revenue standpoint?
Does Disney want to charge for that? I mean, look, I took my kid to Disney 10 years ago, and it was a fortune for three of us to ride rides. Disney doesn't let anybody in unless they get a big cut. So I'm not sure sending cars to Disney is going to be any less. They won't charge taxes, but their fees could be worse than California's taxes. So I don't know. I mean, now look, the point you're bringing up is a really good one. Entertainment districts and theme parks, that sort of thing, are a great application for autonomous vehicles. But, think about San Francisco, another good comparison to Manhattan. I think Chicago Falls, Boston, Washington, D.C., Las Vegas, for that matter. These are cities that are horrible to drive in and difficult to park in. Vegas, maybe not difficult to park, but you're there for a convention, you're there during CES or any major event, driving up and down the strip's pretty horrible. So these autonomous services are great there, and that's kind of what we need, right? I mean, in Manhattan, I've driven there. Terrible to find parking. Chicago, I was there to see the Knicks lose to the Bulls a couple of weeks ago, and this was a Sunday night, and it was tough to find parking.
You're right. If you eliminate the need to find parking, you're going to a game, you might want to go to stop somewhere and have a drink and go to dinner. You have this really great experience. You're not stressed out. Okay, who's driving? Where am I going to park? It eliminates that. And then you can see, like, the Blackhawks could partner with one of the operators and have a Blackhawk experience where you can get dropped off right in front and away you go to the game. That's a really wonderful experience. When will we get to the point where this will be made?
That hasn't been totally worked out yet. So I'm glad I did this. So I went to the Knicks Bulls game. We're getting out of the game on a Sunday night. It was really cold and extremely windy. There is a big lot for Uber and Lyft, for the cars coming by, but availability is an issue. And, finding your car is an issue. We ended up paying too much for a jitney because we couldn't. The first two Ubers blew us off. So it exists. They have these lots for it, but it's not totally perfect yet. And I think the network of all that has to be improved. But look, the foundation's there for it to be a good experience. It's just not completely ironed out just yet, I think.
Why not, from an infrastructure standpoint, on game day, have dedicated lanes? For now, you can do Uber and Lyft. You have a dedicated lane to get to the front, and you do a no waiting zone. You put a couple police officers on a dedicated lane. You can use cones to make the dedicated lane. They check the credentials, show your Uber badge, show your Lyft badge, and you go. That's a lot better experience than having to trek all the way to a lot. You know who does the worst of this is the Atlanta airport, where that it's so far away. Why don't we just see simple things that you can do today that are very low cost?
So you're saying in Atlanta, the Uber and Lyft stand is...
Oh, it's far away from the terminal. You have to go in this long, windy path and out to a parking lot. It's a pain in the neck to get out there.
You have to walk it with all your luggage?
You do.
Oh, God. How about doing that in Atlanta in August?
I hope you're wearing something cool because it's hot.
You're flying in, actually, even a month like June, you're flying in from or let's say May, you're flying in from Detroit, so you're wearing, a thick coat, and then it's 82 degrees and humid, and you've got to walk this long. Yeah, none of this stuff's been, I shouldn't say no, but most of it hasn't been really ironed out yet. I mean, because airports weren't built with this in mind. I mean, you go to LaGuardia and all they've done is kind of kick the cab guys further away, the yellow cab stand, and fewer people come in, but you're still kind of hunting around to find your car. The app will tell you it's not horrible, but problem is the infrastructure around airports right now, and around stadiums for that matter, all of this stuff is very impromptu because they just didn't design it with a bigger kind of what's called a receiving lane for ride hailing services.
It's the point now where the stadium owners or the property owners should consider making that investment. If you look at the economics around consumers going to experiences, it's booming, but you don't want to go to an experience. You're like, oh, I got to go through that again. Oh, what horrible time to find the car to get there. It could be a detriment to their overall business if they can't make it better. And the infrastructure to do that is not that expensive when you look at how much revenue they generate, especially from a pro sports team.
Yeah, there is something. They're going to have to make the move, I think, because if you think about it for a second, like I think about Comerica Park in Detroit, there are a lot of lots all around the stadium that are not owned by the Detroit Tigers, and they're independent lot owners. Any of those lots you could use a small portion of that to be a staging place for people to get picked up by ride hailing. But those people who own the parking lots bought them as an investment. So how do you get them out of there so that fewer people want to drive than drive out of the place? And right now, there really isn't a great disincentive to drive to a game, unless you want to be drinking at the game. But usually, you got a group of people going to the game, so there's one person who's a designated driver. That's not that hard to do. But you got to make the ride-hailing experience great and cheaper than parking. And I think you'll have something. And I think you're right. It might be up to the stadium owners, to entertainment district owners, to make all of this stuff happen.
Without that leadership, it's not going to happen. You're right. The individual that owns the lot, that's their retirement, they're not going to say, oh, come park here for free. And the driver is not going to pay $50 to wait there. It just doesn't make any sense.
No.
So that has to be figured out.
Right.
Looking at all of this, do you think that the future for passenger autonomous vehicles will come down to convenience and experience? If you're in a city and you have an Argo vehicle, you have a Cruise vehicle, you have a Waymo vehicle, will that just come down to the price? Who's the fastest? Who's the cheapest? Or do you think there'll be other incentives for an individual to choose one over another?
Cheap is always good, right? If these rides are significantly more expensive than driving yourself or taking a yellow cab or anything like that, then it's always a tough sell. It's got to be a better experience. I think really the heart of this thing is convenience. If you're going anywhere in the city and ride hailing can make it faster and cheaper than parking, but also just about seamless. And in some places it is. I've had some good experiences with this, but just about seamless to leave at the end of a game, leave when your flight comes in and you catch your bag and just go quickly without having to wait long for the vehicle to look for it. That will work. There is an issue, I think. Look, I've been to some airports where you get your bags and you say, okay, great, I need to get an Uber or a Lyft. You get one. That driver gets stuck in a long line of traffic of people there, whether they're Uber and Lyft drivers or just family and friends going to pick somebody up. I've gone to pick people up and waited half an hour. So that's no longer a great experience. It's no better experience getting an Uber or Lyft than it is having a friend of mine wait for 30 minutes and get all annoyed for picking me up. This is what has to improve. And it really is a matter of having a place for these cars to come and get people quickly and easily and making it really convenient. People don't want to wait is the problem. You don't want to wait with a bunch of bags. You don't want to wait in a big crowd, particularly in time of COVID, and it looks like that's going to be with us for a long time. So it has to be worked out where, it literally is moving the infrastructure, the road lanes, parking lanes, whatever it is, wherever these cars can go to get in and out. These places just aren't designed for it.
The infrastructure has to be completely overhauled, realistically, for this to work the way it's intended to work. But I want to stay in the convenience theme here around wait times. Charging's a big inconvenience today. If you're driving a vehicle, an electric vehicle is not a Tesla, you have to download the Blink app, the ChargePoint app, the Electrify America app, go try and find a charger, plug in and wait. When are we going to get to a point where the charging network becomes seamless and the charge times are able to go down, very similar to going to a gas station? You go to a Sunoco, you go to a Shell, you just put your credit card in and away you go. You don't have to have all the different apps.
I've been wondering about the app side of it for a while. I think the availability is going to get there because places, I'm starting to see more chargers show up in places that people spend an hour or half an hour. Restaurants, big box stores. I've seen them at hotels, which is brilliant because now you can, if you rent a vehicle while you're traveling, you can charge up. And just parking garage, downtown Detroit, people go down there all the time because there's a great restaurant scene, but they don't necessarily live there. And a lot of the garages, the entire first floor, are charging spots. The app question is an interesting one. Does somebody come up with, are they able to come up with an app that it doesn't matter who the charge provider is, your credit card's there, and they have access to collect the payment? In other words, is there just one universal app called Charge that is on the phone because you don't want to look and, you get to a garage and say it's EVgo's charge station. You got to download their app because you don't already have it. I mean, I think you're right. I don't think people want 27 apps for charging on their phone. They'll do it if they like the experience enough. And it's not a barrier to buying an EV, but it would be a lot more convenient if this stuff got homologated under one kind of app.
That to me says Apple, Apple, Apple. I've been thinking a lot about Apple and their car ambitions.
Apple and Android, right? Like both of them. They can go to all these providers and say, hey, look, we know you have your app, but we want to do it. Now, here's the problem. The same reason the car companies have always been reluctant to let Apple and Android into the car. Suddenly, Apple and Android become the face to the consumer. They get the data, they collect a bounty for the fee, and they're the intermediary, and that's what nobody wants. That's what none of the businesses want. Consumers want convenience.
The consumers want convenience. Then Apple's got the Apple Wallet and Apple Pay, and Google has Google Pay and their version of a wallet. Do consumers just start demanding this? And then Apple goes in there, and so maybe Project Titan's all about EV charging? Maybe that's what it is.
I think they're probably doing more than that. But yeah, I think consumers are going to push for this in the same way that a lot of consumers shop cars these days by going to some kind of agnostic vehicle sales site as opposed to the BMW site or the Chevy site or whatever. They go to a site where they can shop everything and do comparisons, and then that directs them to a dealer. But they still don't want to necessarily shop 37 different vehicle sites to look at every brand that's out there.
Does direct-to-consumer eventually overtake the dealer network one day where dealers become a thing of the past?
Yeah, people have been talking about this for a long time. No, I don't think so. I mean, it has worked for Tesla because Tesla started small and they've been able to grow this thing. But if you're a company really that has a big dealer network now, and there's a lot of inventory out there, the car companies don't want to own that real estate or lease it. They don't want to manage that. They'd rather let dealers do that. I think they do want more control over the sales process, and they'd be happy for direct sales to happen that way. But the dealer does play a role, and a lot of it's customer service. I mean, people complain about dealers and customer service, and some of them are very good at it, some not. Better ones are very good at it. But, the car companies, these are B2B companies for the most part. They build vehicles and sell them to a retailer. They're not really customer service companies. So I think there is a role for dealers, but it's already changing, and I think it's going to change more. I think you're going to see more vehicles that are just ordered straight up, and the new car sales process is going to be much more of a direct kind of sale. I mean, during COVID, we saw this, and people didn't want to, the early days of COVID, people were buying cars, but they didn't want to deal in person with a salesperson. So they ordered the car online and someone dropped the car off at their house. I think that's going to end up happening. But the dealer still has a role for service and a lot of these other things that they do, parts, all that stuff.
You bring up a very valid and interesting point around customer service. Now I'm just going to give you a random example here. You have customer A who bought a Ford F-150 Lightning, had an issue, goes in the Ford dealer, they have their issue resolved. And on the other hand, you have an individual that bought a Rivian R1T, And where do they go to get it fixed? Do you think that becomes a competitive advantage for Ford since they have the customer service network, that if there is an issue with the Lightning, the individual knows where to go, or on the Rivian side, they're really not sure where to go?
Oh, Tesla sends, their customers love having the repair people go to them to fix things. And that is an advantage for Tesla. I know Tesla owners, and they absolutely love it. So I'm not sure how Rivian's going to do it. I'm not sure how Lucid is going to do it. Are they going to do the Tesla model because their volume is low enough where they can send people out? I mean, it's got to be an expensive operation to run within a company. But I think there's an advantage the way Americans buy vehicles right now of having this big dealer network where there's a presence on every place has a big Miracle Mile or Auto Sales Mile, whatever, Golden Mile, whatever it's called, where there are a whole bunch of dealerships and people will still go and shop there, or they know they go there to get their cars or get their service done and that sort of thing. It's not an awesome experience a lot of people don't want to go to the dealer for service. They kind of groan about it. And I think the percentage of people who want to go to a dealership and kick the tires and drive the car they're going to take home is getting smaller all the time. So I think dealers are going to have to really change how they do this. Look, the other thing that's going to bring about the change in the dealer experience, again, because of COVID and the semiconductor shortage, car companies are selling cars to customers with far less inventory. And if the inventory isn't there to actually browse and shop, then the dealer part, the physical dealer part of the experience for a buyer becomes less important, because you're just going to go online, and if every dealer has fewer vehicles, you're going to find the dealer that actually has the subset of options, colors, and everything that you want. And if there are 5 Chevy dealerships in a metro area and 2 of them have it, then you're going to deal with those 2 and try to get the best deal you can. You don't have to drive or even shop all these different dealers' websites. You just spec it, and then that's the way it works for a lot of people now. Is you go to a neutral site, you spec it, and they'll show you who has the inventory anyways. And with inventory getting leaner and leaner, there's going to be, I think, the potential for less bargaining between dealerships, because the exact vehicle you want is going to be at fewer actual stores. So, then you just make a bid to the, say, 2 remaining dealers who have the pink BMW M3 with, sparkling gold interior and whatever it is. and then you make a couple of bids, and, if they take it, then you go buy your car. But the inventory thing is I think, going to change a lot. Like, no one's going to come out of the semiconductor shortage, assuming it ever ends, and just carry the bare minimum amount of inventory. They'll carry more inventory than they have today, but they're not going to carry what was customary was 80, 90 days worth of stock. 70 to 90, depending on vehicle line. I think you'll see them carrying more like 40 to 50. Now it's like 12 or 3 in some cases because nobody has anything, but that will change how this works too.
The semiconductor issue, I agree with you. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. It concerns me. You've had remarks recently from Taiwan, from military leadership. If China attacks, we're well prepared to defend ourselves. Oh, great. China's made some interesting moves at Taiwan. If for some reason China was to attack Taiwan, how bad will that be on the global semiconductor? Are we looking at Armageddon, basically, for a defined period of time, but that does happen?
Yeah, you have to think it does. I mean, even if they didn't destroy the plants, and I doubt they would, that's some of the value that they would want to control. But first off, it would drive the prices up ridiculously. There would be huge supply disruption. I mean, if there really was a military conflict, even just a naval blockade is a nightmare. This is why the Biden administration and, really, that the Senate or the Senate's already passed it, still waiting in the House. This CHIPS Act, where they're putting $52 billion in incentives out there to build semiconductor capacity in the U.S. These products are just too essential. And the fact that we've let so much of this production go overseas when we use so many of them here, it's not just about labor costs and all of that. It's a strategic issue that can handicap our own economy and industry here in the U.S. In other words, we have to get fab plants, semiconductor and chip plants built in the U.S. before something awful like that happens.
Chips are one part of the strategic initiative. The other part to me is the minerals to go into electric vehicles, the refining of the minerals. How do we onshore more of that so we're not reliant on foreign countries? If something happens again in the supply chain or a political conflict or a military conflict, we're not like, oh, we're on EVs now. Now what are we going to do? Oh, well, there's a military conflict. We can't do anything. How do we avoid that?
Yeah, they're trying to develop all that stuff. And you're seeing it with battery stuff right now. GM has announced some initiatives to mine lithium in I think, Texas and California, or maybe, yeah, in California for lithium. And they're looking at rare earth metals for the magnets for EV motors with a company in Texas. They're building JVs to do this. Everybody's rushing around to do that. Canada has quite a bit of natural resources. I had a conversation with somebody say, on the policy side of Canada, and they were talking about Canada. Basically, they're trying to market themselves as a good place to build battery plants because they actually have raw materials up there, nickel, cobalt, and they do. And this is an industry here that will create a lot of value. I don't honestly know who has a lock on some of these raw materials that are going to be needed. I mean, look, I know cobalt, Africa, Russia, and I know China's got some rare earth metals that there are places we don't want to do business with that have some of these. So we're going to have to find other places to get these raw materials and develop it here, and also develop alternatives. I mean, there are a lot of lithium iron phosphate batteries. Power density isn't quite there yet, but they're cheaper and the raw materials are easier to get. A lot of experimentation going on with batteries that will use fewer elements from unsavory places, but still get the performance everybody wants.
When you look at the unsavory places, a lot of the cobalt comes from the DRC, more well known as the Congo. They use child labor. When do consumers step up and say, wait a second, I want a conflict-free car? We saw it in diamonds on the luxury sector. When do you think we see it on the vehicle sector so that consumer knows that this is a conflict-free car?
I'm surprised it isn't happening already. I think it's going to happen because, look, a lot of people buy cars. People who buy big, gaudy diamonds probably don't give a damn where they were made. but yeah, I mean, look, car companies have been under pressure for a long time over emissions and carbon footprint and all this kind of thing. And environmental groups have been on them for a long time. And I think humanitarian groups will be, human rights groups will be on this. I'm surprised we haven't had some sort of seal of approval from them already. Now, the answer probably is because there just aren't that many EVs on the market. I mean, the growth has been great, but it's still a pretty small percentage. The other thing is the research probably, look, I don't know where all the materials from a Tesla battery came from. Somebody would have to do that research and come up with a definitive report. But yeah, I can see something like that happen. This is the era of, where social sensibilities really come to the forefront.
Will it take a Jim Farley at Ford or Mary Barr at GM to come out and do that, and then all suddenly Ford's doing this, GM's doing this, everybody falls in line with one of the major players to do that, to shift the industry that way? Or do you think it comes from one of the environmental groups that puts the pressure?
I think it'll be an outside group that puts the pressure on. The car companies are not going to want to get into a situation where they're offending any potential part of the supply chain. I think they're pretty well stung by the supply chain problems they've had with the semiconductor shortage. Until they know they've got a supply chain that they can rely on that's in accessible and friendly places to do business, they're not going to make too big of a stink anywhere. In other words, if something happens to a cobalt source in, let's throw this out there for argument's sake, Canada, and they need to go to the Congo for a while, the DRC, they won't want to have angered every supplier there by saying they're not going to buy from them or have to go back on their word. So they'll keep quiet until they would have the ability to be able to say, hey, these are conflict-free batteries or whatever the designation would be.
As we looked at 22, 23, 24, I think provenance is going to become a larger and larger issue. I think BlackRock will start putting pressure on there to demand the provenance of where this came from, and that will eventually trickle down to consumers. But you look at this EV transition. Over the last 12 months, GM has been very vocal about their transition to electric vehicles. Ford has been very vocal. But Ford stock has gained 132% over the last 12 months, and GM's gained 46%. So Ford's almost tripled GM's performance. Why? Is it the charisma of Farley? What's driving that?
Well, no, I think Ford was considered to be way behind in the EV race, and they hadn't actually announced all that much. GM's been talking about this. Their first big announcement, they said they were going to do 20 vehicles by 2023 globally. That was in late 17. So GM has been getting a bump in the stock from this long series of announcement on electrification for several years, and Ford has been doing it more lately. And Ford stock was down for quite a while. So I think it's, if you're looking at this year, Ford's had more news that says they're in the game when nobody thought they were in the game 15, 18 months ago, right? So it's just more of a recent thing for Ford. Now, interesting part of this is has made a big splash with their plans, their spending on vehicles, the Ultium battery pack, Ultium LLC, which is their joint venture with LG to make the batteries and building battery plants, cell plants. GM's been putting all these bricks in place. Ford actually has the Mach-E to market and it's selling, whereas GM is just getting the Hummer out, and that's a low-volume vehicle. I think it's fair to say Ford's probably unexpectedly won the first round here in which company has a shot at catching up to Tesla. Volkswagen's had the ID4 out, just really hasn't captured a lot of buzz. I haven't read great reviews of it, but the Mach-E is pretty well liked, and GM is still waiting for its first vehicle to hit the market. I think in a couple of years, you'll be looking at a lot of GM vehicles on the market. They'll start to push past Ford. In fact, I've seen a couple of stories analyzing electric vehicle forecasts, and they're saying Ford has, there was a headline, Ford sells more EVs than GM for now. So forecasts are what they are, but GM does have a huge bunch of EVs coming across the globe, and I think you'll really see them make a big leap with those. But look, right now, Ford's going to have the electric F-150 out before the Silverado's out, probably by about a 6-month lead. They have a ton of interest in it. So all of this is pushing the stock up. And I think the optics at the moment are that Ford kind of stole a march on GM after GM did all of this talking and planning and building of battery plants and investor day presentations and everything else. And then Ford just went out and sold a bunch of Mach-E's. So that's really helped the stock quite a bit. And they've got good momentum. There's no question that. Farley's done a pretty good job of getting investors to look at a company that they probably saw as just one big, stinking heap of sunk capital in internal combustion vehicles, because that's how they viewed the traditional car companies until very recently.
How much of Ford's turnaround can you credit Jim Farley for?
He's getting a lot of credit for it. And look, I think he's done a really good job with marketing. Like the Mach-E, is it a real Mustang? I mean, it's a crossover SUV with Mustang design cues. But calling it a Mach-E, a Mustang Mach-E, is pretty brilliant marketing, I think. And it's clearly worked. They're selling this thing very nicely. I wouldn't call it necessarily mass market because it's still fairly expensive, but it's way cheaper than a lot of other EVs on the market. They've had success with it. And then they're going with the F-150. Ford's kind of looking at hero brands of theirs that have big names. Mustang, Mach, Bronco, F-150. I mean, one advantage Ford's always had, certainly over GM, just because GM has so many nameplates and has for so long. They've winnowed it down over the years, but they still have to put marketing time, money behind a bigger number of names and brands. Ford has always been able to really drive so much into just that Ford brand and the big names within it. F-150, Explorer, now Bronco, Mustang. And it's really helped them get notoriety. And I think Farley's done a lot with really seizing on those big name brands, and he's doing it with their electrification program. Now, he's getting the credit because nobody thought Hackett was doing a very good job, but you got to say that the foundations for all of this had to have been laid when he was there, because you don't make a vehicle. It takes 3-4 years to make a new vehicle. So the guy had to have something to do with making it happen. But, Farley came out of marketing with Toyota, and Ford's always been, I think, a better marketing company than most automakers out there. And he's really pushed the names that ring the register.
Focusing on their two iconic brands was savvy. I think Farley's done a much better job communicating to retail investors. He's done a better job communicating to Wall Street, but just to the public in general. I'll never forget, Hackett gave that speech at CES about smart cities, and it didn't go anywhere. It just fell flat, where Hackett's just delivering and delivering. When the F-150 Lightning sales become public and they release the sales numbers, does that put pressure on GM? If these numbers are as large as they're predicted to be, does that put pressure on GM to start moving a larger volume vehicle, as the Hummer, you've clearly said it will be a smaller niche vehicle?
Yeah, it does. And if I'm at GM right now, I'm doing everything I can to pull that Silverado, the Silverado E, ahead and get that to market as close to the electric F-150 as possible. And maybe they will. We're going to hear about this at CES. GM's already telegraphed that they're going to make a big splash with Silverado there. And they'll have some other stuff too. But the Silverado is going to be the star of the show. That could boost the stock, although they've talked about it so much, no one will be surprised by the presentation. But if they move that ahead and it's got some really great features and it can tow and haul and do what pickup trucks are supposed to do in addition to being an electric one, that'll get them back in the game. But if I'm them, the F-150 comes out, I think they start production May of next year. And GM's talking about early 23 for the Silverado. If I'm them, I try to, if they can do it without quality becoming an issue, I try to get that out in the summer sometime. I don't know if they can do it, though.
I agree with that, trying to move that up. The other thing, looking at the GM, I see a lot of them. They're very popular where I live. How about the GMC Yukon? Why not do an electric version of that?
I think those are coming. So the Detroit Hamtramck plant where they're going to make the Hummer, the Silverado, that's going to be the big electric truck plant. That's also where they're making the Cruise Origin, the autonomous vehicle. I think we know they're going to have a Cadillac Escalade type of, big Cadillac SUV there. And trying to remember all the vehicles they told us about, but I'm pretty sure there's going to be a Tahoe Yukon type of large SUV EV coming out of that plant as well. I don't know when, but I know they have that kind of thing in the works.
What year was it when Cadillac came out with the completely redesigned Escalade and the sales just went bonkers and through the roof? Can they do the same thing with an electric version of the Escalade to capture that market that they had for the premium luxury SUV segment with a completely new design?
I think they can. I mean, look, it's been, I think that family of GM full-size SUV, the Tahoe Yukon Escalade, it's got to be, year and a half, 2 years now, if that. Maybe a little less, but yeah, maybe it is 2 years. But these might be longer than that. It may have been before the strike, which was in 19. Yeah, you're looking at, let's call it 2 years. I can't remember the exact date. But yeah, the sales have done really well. They grabbed back a lot of market share that they lost to Ford and Land Rover and Mercedes. And the Escalade name, it's one of the true hits. I mean, it probably is the hood ornament of GM and Cadillac. Yeah, they make that an electric vehicle. I think it's going to do well. They say they're getting a lot of interest in the crossover SUV coming out, the Lyric. That's coming out fairly early next year, I think. So, yeah, I think they'd get a ton of attention with that. Every time a new Escalade's come out, it's just built its lead in the luxury large SUV business.
Now, if they can just get the charging infrastructure to charge it, we have the announcement out of the White House where they're going to put all the billions of dollars in the charging infrastructure. But that issue we're going to have to overcome significantly because I think there is a bright future for GM as it relates to electrification. And I can't wait to see the day when GM makes an announcement that they spin Cruise out and see what type of valuation they get. That's going to be another interesting day for GM.
That is. And that's a curious one because Dan Ammann, the CEO, has incentives to either sell it or IPO it in his contract. He's got a long time to do it. But when GM made their Investor Day presentation where they said they were going to double revenue by the end of the decade, which is adding another $140 billion in revenue, Cruise was $50 billion of that. So that implies that they will be somehow connected to Cruise from a financial standpoint. Maybe they spin out a minority ownership of it or something like that. We'll see. But they do need to remain connected, right? For the revenue and for the vehicle development side of it. How they structure that will be very interesting.
It will. And I believe it'll be good for shareholders if it's structured properly. It will unlock a lot of shareholder value.
It could. I mean, look at Harley today spinning out their electric motorcycle business. Wasn't that the news this morning?
The markets are clearly, at this point, are gobbling up anything electric vehicle, anything autonomous vehicle. How long that lasts is anyone's guess. The valuations are through the roof.
Last week, we had Mary Barr at the Automotive Press Association of Detroit in a fireside chat, and she was asked, as she often gets asked, what are you going to do if there's Wall Street pressure to spin out your electric vehicle business? And her answer is a good one, which is, okay, electric vehicle is just powertrain. That's all you're talking about. Why would we spin that out? It's just part of our operations. Everything else we do, the vehicle around it, the software and services we're going to sell, it's all related to it. But she's kind of saying, to put it in more simple terms, it's like she doesn't want to pull the eggs out of the omelet after the omelet's already been served. And also, the other part of this, from a financial perspective, so let's suppose GM did spin out Ultium as this electric vehicle business. One business, the old GM, is just this industrial company selling internal combustion vehicles. And maybe it's a public stock, maybe private equity guys buy it, and all they're going to do is just run it for cash until it dies and then sell the pieces at the end. So that unit is no longer generating the cash GM needs to make EVs. So this new Ultium business has to go out there and raise money the way Rivian and Lucid and Tesla do. Now, Tesla and probably Rivian, maybe Lucid, they can raise money for a long time, but you're still out there hat in hand, hoping investors will buy your stock and your debt. Tesla has no problem doing that, but there's only one Tesla. You're adding a bunch of risk to a business that doesn't have a lot of risk other than out there in the market right now. This strikes me as something investment bankers like to do because it creates a new stock and a lot of fees for them. And if it doesn't work out in the long run, so what? But if you're GM, your pickup truck and SUV cash flow is funding your electric vehicle and autonomous ambitions for free. Why would you split the company so you can go out and pay interest on convertible debt and sell equity at a high price?
To me, it makes no sense. I like Mary's response. I think she's done a wonderful job running GM, and she's not giving into it. You're right. As it relates to Tesla, there's only one Elon Musk. To me, it's the two of them go hand in hand, and you really can't separate him from the Tesla brand. And looking to 2022, what are you looking for in the mobility markets of publicly traded companies? Do we have consolidation? Do we have a run on shorts? Do we have surprise revenue growth? What are you looking for in the public markets as it's directly related to mobility, both electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles?
It's a good question. Everyone's favorite parlor game is when we're talking about electric vehicle stocks is which companies are overpriced and does the bottom fall out of these things at some point? And usually it gets down to like Lucid and Rivian with these massive, massive valuations. And when do they come back to earth? And for that matter, there's still some people who think Tesla will come back to earth. Tesla's still viewed as a tech company and a growth company. So the multiple of earnings is going to be high, I think, for a while until I don't see what takes away that perception among investors that Tesla's just another car company. I think players like Lucid and Rivian, because they don't have battery storage and solar businesses and the software capabilities of somebody like Tesla, and they don't have Elon Musk. Because of all that, I think they're much more susceptible to investors saying, well, wait a second, this is just a car company, you know? And if it's a luxury car company because they sell expensive stuff, maybe they should trade at 8 to 10 times earnings, which is where BMW and Daimler trade. And that would bring the price down quite a bit because they're not really earning anything. And I think they have much more risk of something like that happening than basically a repricing of the multiple than Tesla does. So I think that can happen. But again, everybody thought this was going to happen to Tesla years ago, and it never did. I know, there are a lot of people who very publicly lost a lot of money shorting Tesla, waiting for some of this stuff for the company to go broke or for a reset on the multiple at which it trades, and it didn't happen. So I'm not giving anybody investment advice. I'm just saying there's a greater risk it happens to Lucid and Rivian than there is to any of the other players on the market. And then some of these smaller companies, Workhorse, Lordstown, Nikola, Fisker for that matter, they all have to prove that they can get a vehicle to market that does what they say it's going to do, has quality and reliability, and that people want to buy it. All of them are in the prove it mode. At least, Rivian seems to have quite a bit of interest in the product. Lucid has very good technology, and they've had reservations on the vehicle, but the Air is a very expensive car. They're still in prove it mode on the SUV, and we'll see with these guys.
We're going to learn a lot as we look to 22. I think some of these companies are no longer going to be around, or some will be merged with each other. But from an analyst perspective and from your perspective covering the news, it's going to be a lot of fun to cover it and to watch it because you're going to get a lot of stories. And from an analyst perspective, we're going to learn a lot. And David, as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them?
Let me throw one question back on you. Are most of your listeners investors, or are they people in the industry itself?
I would say it's about a 50-50 mix. There's quite a few investors.
Sort of refer to your last question for the investor crowd. I'd really keep an eye on, very close eye on what happens with some of even the more successful startups. And I put Lucid and Rivian in the camp of the more successful startups. Fisker, I'm not sure what to make of yet, but really watch the developments there and see if they can come out with vehicles that are going to sell. And there's a lot of popularity and hype around Rivian name and the design of those pickup trucks. I'd keep an eye on that. There's still stocks that can be very, very volatile going forward. On the other side, on the autonomous side, I think this could be kind of a prove-it year for a lot of these companies, just in terms of getting the market. There's still a long road ahead of us, so to speak, in terms of autonomy, because it is really difficult to make these cars work and then to build infrastructure and find out what the right business case is and how these businesses ought to work. I mean, think about the beginning of this conversation. We're talking about, what's the best way to pick people up at an airport or a stadium or a central business district. And some places do it better than others. So that's the kind of business where it's just really started trying to find its legs. But I do think some of these big players like Cruise and Waymo, who've gotten out there early, this could be a year where they prove that this at least can be done, that you can actually get these services running and that the cars actually work. That'll be big. Every other company gets hurt if Waymo and Cruise have a tough time just getting the cars to work safely and properly.
I'll give you another example of how other companies get hurt. If Waymo or Cruise comes out and announces we're fully driverless and we're booking $1 million a quarter in revenue, that's going to send a very big message, because you and I both know nobody's nearly close to that number. That's going to be a very telling sign when the revenue comes. And the big question as we look to 22, will the hype translate into sales and revenue? That's the $1 million question that I'm looking for. And we'll find out next year. And David, I look forward to having you back on next year to see where this all goes, because the future's bright, the future's autonomous, and the future's electric. David, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Thank you. Great being here with you as always, man.
Thanks. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed in this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.